I think we get going. Yeah, all good. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Great that you can you make it. These problematic students down the front, not to give me a kick with. Right. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Joe Baker. Joe for many years was at York University in Toronto, and I guess 12 months ago moved to the University of Toronto, which just down the road. But a really interesting position. He was appointed as the chair of, as you can see, the Tenenbaum Institute for Science in Sport, which was actually set up on the basis of a $20 million investment or donation from the Tenenbaum family for sport and data science in sport. So he's taken on the role of the chair there and has a really interesting role now, trying to figure out how to spend all that money in a useful way. He's some ideas. And if you have any problems, we'll help you out figure out how to do that. I'd say he's probably the leading scholar, the leading theorist in talent identification in the world, an incredibly prolific writer with many papers and books, hundreds of papers and books. We use his books as our textbook for the bachelor and master course for talent identification and development. So it's his shout tonight on the back of those rich academic royalties that I'm sure are flowing in from us. But great you could be here. Thanks very much for coming. And yeah, we're really looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. I'm excited to be here. I don't know how much people at the Free University take this for granted, but the reputation that you guys have internationally for the quality of work that happens here, it's quite an honor for me to be here. As Dave said, I'm at the Tenenbaum Institute for Science and Sport, which in Canada is a very sort of new initiative. It's the first and maybe the only one, at least in Canada, that focuses on high performance sport. So as much as we appreciate sport for all and the need for more sport in the general population, the mandate of the Tenenbaum Institute is all high performance. Larry Tenenbaum, who is one of the donors, is the owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Toronto Raptors, the Toronto FC Football Club. He now owns the new Toronto WNBA team. So he has a very sort of high performance focused agenda. And as somebody who's worked in high performance sport for 25 years, it's so nice to have some support now to do the kind of work that we're doing. I'm going to talk about talent today, not because I particularly like talent identification and what it means for mainstream sport, but because we have an entire sports system in most industrialized countries of the world that focus on this concept. When we stream kids into high performance programs or recreational leagues, we're doing that on the basis of something, and that's something we could call talent. So I want to start with that as our broad sort of foundation, because the reality of high performance sport is we don't have unlimited resources to keep everyone. We don't have enough coaches. Coaches are probably the most important resource limitation that we have. We don't have enough educated and skilled high performance coaches, regardless of the level of skill of our athletes. We don't have enough people to go around. And so we have to make decisions about who gets access to those coaches. So when we talk to practitioners in sports fields and we say, doesn't talent identification suck? They all say, yeah, of course it does. But tell me another solution. Give me a different system, because the one that we have right now says I've got 50 kids and I have to choose 12. And so coaches know the limitations of their system, but the reality of the high performance sports system that we have requires these sorts of things because of the limitations. If we think about what talent is, this is something that we in my research group have probably spent too much time thinking about. And the reason for this is when we bring a dozen people into a room and we ask for a definition of talent, we almost always get a dozen different definitions. From a scientific standpoint, if we can't agree on the thing that we're trying to measure, then we have a problem in terms of validity and reliability. I think at a conceptual level, we could probably all come up with a agreed upon definition of what talent is. It's that difference between individuals that relates to their likelihood of success. Well, is that physical? Is that psychological? Is that work ethic? Is it persistence? Is it just pure physical and technical talent that we see in athletes? And so what exactly is it? We can agree that there's probably something, but what it is from a measurement standpoint is something else entirely. From a practice standpoint, those kinds of things that we can say to coaches, measure this in the here and now, because it's got some objective predictive value for this future outcome that you're interested in. Those are where we have our challenge. So as a scientific concept, we can agree that there's differences between people that are going to affect their likelihood of success. You know, if you're 5 foot tall or 1.4 meters tall, your likelihood of being a great basketball player is probably limited. But the things that make a great basketball player is not just height. At the NBA level, height doesn't predict a single outcome performance related, but you never say height isn't important for a basketball player. And so the challenge is, how do we come up with these things that we can give to coaches in the here and now that are going to allow them to predict with some kind of accuracy future success? I would argue we can skip to the conclusion. I would argue that we don't have those things and that we shouldn't do that. So in practice, I think talent as a concept has very limited practical utility. It's a great concept for scientists who build conceptual models and want to understand variance at the population level. But when we're making decisions about this individual versus that individual, I don't think we should do that on talent. And that's the case I'm going to try to make today, and hopefully try to convince you of my conclusion, and then maybe suggest some ways forward. Why do we care? Well, this is the reality of high performance sport. A lot of these are from the US, which has one of the most aggressive talent identification systems on the planet. But the Netherlands isn't innocent in this scenario. Maybe the most egregious and overblown, I think, talent identification is this 18-month-old child that was signed to a professional contract. Everybody, even the parents, knew that that was craziness. But this is what talent identification looks like. And so all these examples to say that the way that we think about talent has consequences. The reality is the kinds of environments that we place our athletes in have a long-term influence on their likelihood of success. And so anytime we stream people into environments of lesser or worse quality, we're affecting their likelihood of success. And so these decisions that we make have consequences. In sport, we make these decisions early, right? 18 months, some football academies, that's rare, but 5, 6, 7 streaming into Premier League academies in the UK, that's not that surprising to us anymore. We've gotten so used to it that these kinds of things are not surprising. In ice hockey, it's the norm to stream kids into levels of competition at under 7 years of age. Once they're put into those levels of competition, it's really difficult to move to a different level. They have a AAA, AA, single A level. If you're in the single A and you want to move to the AAA as a 9-year-old, for example, it's very difficult, if not impossible, right? So these decisions have consequences, not because we're great at identifying talent. I'm going to show you some data that suggests the opposite, but because these decisions have long-term implications on potential for success. Most of the industrialized world has a talent identification system that looks like this, where we look at a normal distribution of athletes. We choose the ones that are at the far right-hand side of our distribution, but we choose them to go on in our selection system or our competitive pathway. And we do that at subsequent steps. The number of steps, when they happen, what coaches look for, those will vary by sport, but this is essentially our athlete development pathway. This system assumes that athletes need to be identified and streamed, that if we just let it happen organically, we're going to miss athletes. I think we could challenge that assumption. And we can talk about that a little bit later if you want an example. But this assumption is a big one, right? The system is useful. The system is important because otherwise we're going to miss talent. It also assumes the system's good at this process. The final assumption is that these characteristics that we're interested in, these things that we use to stream our athletes, is normally distributed. I think all of these assumptions can be challenged to a more or less extent, but we call this the standard athlete development approach, or the SAD approach. Okay, the reason it's SAD is quite significant, right? If we take, for example, this is a thought exercise my grad students and I did a couple of years ago, where we looked at the starting population of players in the basketball system in the United States. Any year, there's about 3.5 million young boys playing organized basketball at the public school or primary school level. If you want to go on to the NBA, you have to go to a high school that's got a basketball program. Of the high schools in the US, there's about 18,000 with basketball programs. So in a single selection step, we've gone from 3.5 million kids now to just over 500,000 kids. From there, you almost always have to go to a Division I basketball program. There's 346 of those in the US. And now in 2 selection steps, we're down to about 4,500 players. There's about 19,000 players playing at the college level across all of those college systems. But if you want to make it to the NBA, you normally have to come from a D1 school. From there, the NBA has what's called a draft, where teams are slotted in randomly or based on previous season performance to choose players for their team for the next year. The draft system in the US was created, and it goes across all the major sports. It was created to try to equalize advantages that teams get. So if you're the worst team one year, you have a greater likelihood to choose first in the draft, so you get the best player the following year. In the NBA, they have a 2-round system. They choose about 60 players each year, and of those, about 50 go on to play at the NBA. So they've got a pretty good success rate. 50 out of 60 is a pretty good proportion. The interesting thing, and the reason this is a SAD model, is that as sports scientists and researchers, we spend a disproportionate amount of our time focusing on the end of the pathway. 99.9% of the people are removed in the first couple of selection steps. Where do we get them back? Right, as I mentioned, once they're deselected, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get back into the system. We calculated that the odds of somebody at the pre-secondary school level making it to the NBA is 1 in 70,000. And we are producing great NBA players. Anybody watching the finals, we're seeing amazing basketball. So we have an effective system, but we don't have an efficient one. What happens to those other 69,999 players, right? Do they continue to play recreational basketball? Do they drop out? A lot of them come to Europe and play in secondary leagues. They make Olympic teams. And so they have some basketball exposure, but certainly not 69,000 of them. So what happens to that group? That's an efficiency question. So the way we think about talent has consequences. The other thing is the evidence suggests we're not very good at finding it. So that 1 out of 70,000, is that the best we can do? Can we get there in a more efficient way? Do we want to get there in a more efficient way? So we've spent the last 10 years or so looking at the accuracy of predictive decisions about athlete performance. A lot of this has taken place at the draft level. And the reason for that is because the data is available. It's easy to access. From a development standpoint, it's a good population because it happens relatively late in the pathway. Most of the time, these are kids that are at least leaving secondary school, if not the college or university systems. And so we're late in the pathway at that point. What the data suggests, though, is that our predictions aren't very good. And normally they fall similar to this study that we did back in 2011. Here we looked at the accuracy of professional sports drafts in ice hockey, American football, basketball, and Major League Baseball. And what we're interested in is just predicting future games played. We looked at games played as our outcome variable because teams will have different strategies for how they use players. Leagues will vary in terms of what performance indicators are most important. But if you're serving the role that your team has for you, you're going to play games. And so a global measure of value is games played. And when we do a simple correlation between what space were you selected in the draft and how many games did you go on to play, we find that the accuracy is not very good. So even the NBA, which I said has a pretty good prediction accuracy, only counts for about 17% of future games played in draft selection. Remember, they only have a 2-round system. In baseball, it's in some of the rounds go to 50, 60 rounds. The worst is Major League Baseball. 3% of future games played is predicted by draft selection rank. The reason for that is if you talk to people that work in baseball, they don't choose people in the draft to play at the major league level. They play for them to go to the development league, the AAA league or the AA league. And there they nurture and manage them and provide them with opportunities to see whether they've got what it takes to the major leagues. But even if we wait until relatively late in the pathway, so high school or college level, even if we throw millions of dollars, if not tens of millions of dollars, trying to figure out the answer to this question, this is what we can aspire to: 3 to 17% of variance accounted for. Now, it would be easy to say, well, yeah, those are terrible statistics. But I don't know if it's for us to say. When we talk to people in baseball, they're not surprised by 3%. Oh, yeah, that's okay. We don't expect it to do much. It's a filter for us. And so I think we have to rationalize these sorts of statistical conventions relative to the context that we're talking about. So why is talent selection so difficult? The reason it's so difficult is because we like it that way, right? We're going into the European Cup. If we knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Germany and the Netherlands are going to play in the finals and Germany's going to win, why would we watch? Right? We like that randomness. We like that unpredictability. If it was more predictable, it wouldn't be the sport that we created. We'd figure out a way to make it less predictable because that's what we like as humans. That's why sport is so interesting to many of us. So we have a couple of fundamental problems. One is that development is complex and complicated. Complicated in the sense that there's a lot of moving parts, tactics, physical elements, cognitive elements, psychological elements, but complex in the sense that we don't really understand how these things fit together, evolve, and interact over time. There's also some evidence from human psychology and performance that suggests that our developmental systems don't like stability very much. So when you probably experienced this in your own life where you get to a point where you've achieved something and you set your sights on the next thing to achieve. We don't like to sit in stable patterns of satisfaction. And that's probably got an evolutionary basis that probably wouldn't be that great if we just sort of sat back and were satisfied all the time. But performance looks like this. Mental health looks like this. When things should be nice and stable, we'll figure out a way to make them unstable. Our own performance is like that as well. And so this entropy that's built into human development and human performance is a critical thing that we have to overcome if we really want to understand how to build predictive models for talent identification. These are fundamental things that we really can't solve. We've got to just appreciate and understand the implications that they have for the models that we do produce. Some things that maybe are a little more controllable for us. We don't really have good models of talent in sport. We borrow models from education or psychology or music. We don't really have sort of homegrown models of what talent is in a sports setting. And part of that is because talent is a relatively new thing for sports scientists. We love it now. It's a really hot topic. But if you look at this trajectory in terms of articles published in scientific journals, it's not until around 2000 that we start to see this inflection point in terms of research in this area. What happened there, we can blame the Aussies for this, right? The 2000 Sydney Olympics were happening at this time. So what happened, a lot of money went into identification and understanding this athlete development process. And it stayed there, right? All of the subsequent Olympic Games adopted this sort of high talent identification focused delivery system and high performance athlete development system. So we have to understand, though, that for science to work, we need to have time. We need to have ideas get pushed around and challenged, and my lab replicates what your lab did, and all these things. In order to really push our ideas around, we need more than 25 years of time. What has happened, though, is we get a pattern of research in this area that's a little bit lopsided. So this is from a scoping review we did a couple of years ago, and you can't maybe see this at the back, but this huge line at the front is research on football. Almost every other sport is a distant second to the amount of knowledge that we have about football. If we look at it by country, again, blame the Aussies here. Australia is the #1 country in terms of research produced in the talent science space. Now, that's only relevant if you think that there's differences between sports and differences between countries and contexts that matter in terms of understanding athlete development. If you think all athletes in all sports are the same everywhere, then this isn't a problem. But what you could say, I think, from our perspective is we have a pretty good understanding of how Australia does things. We have a pretty good understanding of how football does things, but everything else is pretty much an incomplete picture. So we need to do a better job of building talent models, because talent in sport isn't just physical or technical. It's psychological, it's perceptual and cognitive. It's all of these things interacting over developmental time. The thing that makes sport even more complicated is we're not trying to understand what predicted performance in Tokyo. We're trying to understand how performance is going to evolve between Olympic Games so that we can predict what's going to win in Paris. So the target we're trying to understand is constantly moving, constantly evolving. If that wasn't difficult enough, we don't really understand the implications of early indicators of success and their value for predicting long-term outcomes. And one of the reasons for this is the things that predict success early in the pathway and the variables that are necessary for success late in the pathway are not the same variables. Okay, I mentioned before that height doesn't predict a single performance outcome at the NBA level, but that doesn't mean height's not important. It means that our population variance has shifted over time. We've got a population that's homogeneous for height now. And so, yeah, look for height and predicted adult height when you're talking about young kids, but don't use that as a predictor later in the pathway because it has no value. It has no variance. In order to have prediction, we need to have variability between the people in our population. Where do we see variability at the elite level? Oftentimes it's in the more cognitive and perceptual elements. Decision-making, creativity, anticipation, those types of things. We don't understand how those future outcomes develop over time. Do we need to have a certain amount of physical or movement experience to be able to develop anticipation? If so, when does that occur? How much do they need to have? Can we intervene so that we can acquire it more quickly? All of these questions are completely open at the moment because we don't have enough research being done in that area. We also have inadequate knowledge of how this talent or these indicators of talent change across development. We do know that as the time horizon of our prediction increases, so that further away from our prediction the actual outcome happens, the less accurate that prediction is going to be. Because of entropy, because of human complexity, because of the fact that we're just not simple to predict. And so we want to try to make those predictions as soon as possible towards the outcome of interest. In our scoping review, we showed that we have a pretty good understanding of data on peak performance across developmental time, but most of this data is cross-sectional. So we have a good understanding of what an elite 7-year-old looks like, what an elite 13 or 15-year-old looks like. But if we're interested in what an elite adult performer looks like, then cross-sectional data is not good enough. We need to have an understanding of not just the best performers at every age group across development, but the worst performers who are able to stay in the system across development. Because we need to know whether the trajectory of human development looks like this, where that performer is always at the top of their population, whether it looks like this, which is much more, it fits better with models of human motivation and development. We want to be constantly improving in our senses of competence. That's something that keeps us motivated to practice. Or does it look like this, where it's just a chaotic mess that's not predictable? The important question here that we talk to coaches about is not how good do I need to be as an under 13, but how bad could you be as an under 13-year-old and still have a chance of success, right? Just a reframing of the same question that coaches ask. The other thing that we've had great discussions with Dave about is the biases that we currently have in our athlete identification and selection system. Some of these are system biases, age and maturity-driven effects. This is the really well-known relative age effect in the NHL. If you're born, the NHL uses a cutoff date of January the 1st to group people into age categories. If you're born immediately after that cutoff date, you're more likely to make it to the NHL, despite the fact that these cutoffs start at the under 7 level. Why? Well, if I'm comparing people to put into my streaming system and you're up to 12 months older than the rest of the kids you're being compared against, you're going to look bigger, stronger, faster because you're older. The maturity-based effects are the same thing in terms of looking at this as rate of maturation. The assumption is that we don't all mature at the same rate, that there'll be some people that are maturing faster than others, some people slower. And if we don't control for that, we get this same kind of bias at the end of our system because of how important engagement in the system is, not because this is some magical indicator of potential. Again, coaches look at size, speed, power as indicators of talent, and they're confusing it with just indicators of how long have you been alive on planet Earth. The interesting thing about the relative age effect is it looks like this at the population level, but if you look at who is more likely to end up in the Hall of Fame, who's more likely to have a longer career, in professional football, who makes more money in their professional contracts, we actually see this profile. And we don't have a real understanding of this yet, but the hypothesis is if you're able to stay in that system that's disadvantaged against you, either you're a better player to begin with, you have more talent, or the system allows you to develop skills that are better than the people that you're being compared with. So maybe we don't want to get rid of this relative age effect completely, because for some individuals, it seems like it's providing a pretty positive environment for their development. We also know that there are socioeconomic status biases. Most of the work in this area, and it's surprising how limited this is, most of the work in this area suggests that the bias is at the entry point of the system. So getting kids from lower SES to engage in the system in the first place. Once we get them in the system, it doesn't seem like it affects their likelihood of success, but the filter is getting them in the system in the first place. We also know that in certain areas of the world, geography is important. This is a trend that we see in the United States and Canada and Australia, where if you come from a really small rural community, you're at a disadvantage in terms of your likelihood of success. The interesting part is if you come from a very large urban area, you're also at a disadvantage. We're not exactly sure why this is. It could be that people from urban areas, the demand for sporting activities is so great that they don't get enough time to just spontaneously practice and train as you would in a smaller location. It could be that In Canada, for example, in Toronto, we have less people interested in playing ice hockey because Toronto has a much more multicultural community and there are people that come from different areas. If we were to look at what development of cricket players looks like, we might have a different profile, but we haven't figured out exactly what the mechanism of effect is here, but it's pretty consistent, at least over the last 30 years. We also have information processing biases that show up among scouts, recruiters, and coaches. This is the Cognitive Bias Codex. Almost 200 different cognitive biases have been identified that cluster in a smaller number of specific areas. But all this to say that coaches' brains are the same human brains that we all have. And so if our brains are biased in terms of how we process things, especially in risk-taking decisions, then it makes sense that coaches would be prone to these same kinds of biases. The last thing that we've been focusing on in our research group is how do we manage data quality and measurement. Part of this is trying to explore other indicators. If our current level of variance accounted for is so small, then we've got to look at different measures instead of looking at the same things we've always looked at. And so we're trying to figure out, from our perspective, we're trying to figure out predictors of not the outcome, not who's going to make it to the NHL or to the Premier League final, but who's going to stay in the process long enough to be able to acquire the skills necessary to be able to execute at the premier level. So it's again, a subtle difference in terms of the way we're thinking about these variables, but do they predict the engagement in the process? So things like self-regulation, persistence, resilience, maybe even enjoyment. These are the kinds of things that we're exploring from a measurement standpoint. And then from a quality standpoint, we're trying to get a better handle on the quality issues in large data sets. So for example, we're starting to use machine learning algorithms and some generative AI data sets to be able to use high amounts of data, but the limiting factor then becomes the quality of the data that we have. And so can we control some of the heterogeneity that we get in these massive data sets, which a lot of that stuff is not very useful. So how do we improve? Well, one is we can try to improve the accuracy of our predictions by developing better models, more precise measures, reducing the impact, all of those kinds of things. And part of that requires us to recognize the limits of current knowledge. So we need to get coaches to accept the fact that their predictions are going to be terrible, right? If we go to a coach and we say, I want you to think about your predictions, and I want you to consider the way you interact with your athletes from the position of you're probably wrong instead of I'm definitely right. When we get coaches to buy into that, they treat their athletes differently. They think about the question, this thing that is maybe the most complicated thing we ever ask a human to do, predict that person's development 10 years from now. We don't do that in education systems. We don't do that in any other context, but we ask coaches to do that. Let's understand the implications and the risks associated with that process. Most people in the world think about talent selection as a binary. It's a yes or a no, but it isn't. It's a yes, a no, a maybe question. There are people that are just clearly they've got something. And so we will probably get a high degree of agreement on the yes part of that equation. We could probably identify the people that are just absolutely terrible at a task and make some kind of agreement in terms of the no's. The challenge are all these people in the maybe group that we would love to keep and love to continue to work with, but we don't have the resources. So maybe the best that we can get in terms of how we should be thinking about the problem is to try to shrink the size of that maybe group, right? We're never going to get 100% accuracy. We're never going to get this so that it's a binary question, but can we shrink that maybe group with some of our predictions and some of our measurement? I'll go over this, I think, pretty quickly because I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. But one of the other things that we found in terms of trying to assess the accuracy is we need to appreciate how complicated the question is. So this is some data from the NHL draft. The NHL has a 7-round draft system. So each team, each round gets to make a choice. What we found was that the accuracy of those choices changes based on the round that athletes are selected in. So people that are selected in the first and second round, those choices are pretty accurate. People that are selected in the seventh round, they go nowhere. And so those choices are also pretty accurate. Where the challenge is, though, is this zone in the middle where we don't know what's going on. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. It's a complete washout in terms of the accuracy. And so really you could look at this decision-making as a three-step process. It's not a single process that the same decision-making is used across the entire draft selection exercise. So we get high levels of accuracy at these three time points, and we try to explain why that is. Most of the time we look at it in terms of pre-entry selection bias, relative age, maturity effects, the relationship between certain indicators from maybe a physical testing battery or a combine. We look at trying to predict that that bias or that amount of variance accounted for. One of the things that we've started looking at, though, is trying to understand likelihood of future success after the point that they've been drafted. So how does the environment that that athlete is now placed into as an 18-year-old, still developing human being, how does that environment affect their likelihood of success? One of the things that is quite clear is that the accuracy that we see here, at least a certain amount of it, is an illusion because of something called the sunk cost effect. Think about the professional sports in North America where the first round draft pick can make $15 or $20 million more than the person who's immediately selected after them. So the first person to the second person can be $10 million. Well, if I've spent an additional $10 million on a player, even if they're not performing at the level that I would like them to, I'm going to let them play more because I've just spent $10 million on them. I'm going to provide them with more opportunities for growth. When we do that, that's called the sunk cost effect. You've already paid the 10 million. It doesn't matter if you continue to play that player. The money is gone, but decision makers in high performance sport will continue to play that player, even in the absence of good evidence to do that. So we know part of this success is about opportunity, about involvement. So what we're trying to do is to figure out, well, how much of this could be about opportunity, right? And maybe draft selection isn't a great indicator of talent, but it's a filter for opportunity. Again, reshuffling the way that we think about this question. And so that might be a way that we can improve the accuracy. Another thing that we could do is reduce the impact of these selections. Okay, so I said that when we stream people into these systems, the challenge is moving once you're placed into a stream. And so can we come up with ways to make that movement easier? So that putting people into a AAA ice hockey program as a 7-year-old doesn't really affect their likelihood of success. Part of the ways we do that is not so much the treatment of the athletes that are selected, but better treatment of the ones that are getting deselected. I don't know how many people here have had this experience, but when I was young, the way that they used to select teams was you did a tryout and then they posted a notice on the bulletin board and you looked for your name. We can do better than that, right? Especially if we think that our decisions are not very good, then now we have an obligation to nurture. We have an obligation to help soften the landing of these athletes, especially when you think about cognitively what's happening in the brain of a 13-year-old and what happens in terms of their involvement in social groups, all of these kinds of implications for this decision on that developing individual. I think we can do a better job of softening that landing. And part of that is maybe it's like a report card. Here are the indicators that we used to evaluate players. Here's how we made our decisions. Here are the ones that you met, and here are the ones that you didn't meet. I want to see you next year. I want you to spend the off season working on these areas. Most of the time they won't, because they've got critical feedback. But what you've done is you've changed the agency of that decision from the system to the individual, right? And so that agency issue could be important for future engagement. We could also develop a pathway system that allows what we call parallel development opportunities. So we don't just have a single team that we develop. Yeah, we've got a single team that gets like the highest quality of resources, but we have B and C levels that get something. So they get some additional resources, whether that's second best training time, less one-on-one time with the coach, but some one-on-one time. We can do that to try to promote engagement with the system. Ultimately, what we're moving towards is a system that focuses less on identification and more on development. Recognizing that the impact that coaches have is going to be through development opportunities. And if we can figure out a way to make it easier for athletes to engage in the system, then we have greater capacity for talent to emerge later. What we have now, because we have a closed system, that SAD model, is we have to be really accurate in terms of our predictions because we've deselected so many people early in the pathway. If we kept more of them around for longer, those selection decisions would be less important. So what's possible? I have no idea, but I can tell you what's not possible. I can tell you that we're never going to get 100% accuracy. That's off the table. But can we get a little bit better? Can we get better than 17% in the NBA? I think so, but it's going to require a different type of thinking. We're also not going to get a predictive equation that stays stable over time. Some of the tests that we did with German handball, we came up with really great predictive models on explaining player performance. And then when we use that same model to predict player performance in the next year, the model falls apart because the cohort changes. The tests in terms of their practical utility change over time. We also won't have a general model that fits everyone. Again, one of the consequences of the SAD model of athlete development is that it assumes that everybody is going to thrive and be nourished by that type of system. Some people, it's a perfect fit for them early on, and they can thrive in it throughout. Some people emerge later as great performers. If we have a system that's closed and isn't allowing them access, we'll never know it because they're just not going to be welcome. So a couple takeaways before we get to the hard-hitting questions. Identification and selection has consequences. Decisions we make about talent are generally not as good as we think, so we should try to avoid them when at all possible. Recognizing that we have a system that is going to require it at certain times. And so when we do that, can we figure out a way to deliver that feedback and to select those athletes that has fewer consequences? Thanks, everyone. I love questions. I'm here to get pushed around, so don't feel like you need to take it easy on me. And again, thanks, Dave, for the welcome and the invitation to speak to you all.
Right, thanks, Joe. I don't have questions, but some hard-hitting questions for Joe. Yeah, right. So it seems like the stepwise selection process basically should yield the result that the selection tests that are being used, are in use, should give a perfect prediction, right? Because they are used as a filter.
Yeah, it's a good, from that perspective, it's surprising that we don't see greater predictive utility of those things. I think part of it is when we talk to people that use those kinds of test batteries, and I'm thinking about, the NHL and the NFL, they have these amazing combine things that they do. They're widely broadcast. When you talk to scouts and people that actually make the decisions, they don't see much value in those things. Those things are for the fans. But you're right. If that was the only test we use, we should see 100% predictive accuracy.
Something that is other thing might be that there's a lot of random external events that may affect the career of an athlete.
Yeah, which is the problem with the holy grail of data analytics, which is predicting injury, right? Which none of our predictive models have any kind of stability there. And part of it is we have to accept that a lot of the variance is accounted for by randomness and just pure chance. We're starting to explore that a little bit in some of our modeling, really get an understanding of luck. We've got too many stories from athletes of, yeah, I just ran into this coach on the street one day, or my favorite is I dyed my hair blue right before selections and coaches paid more attention to me that day. They never noticed I was there before, right? And so how do we capture that in a predictive model? Yeah.
I'm always surprised how successful concepts are that are not defined at all in science. But I had an idea myself that I have some feeling what talent is, or the talent of sport, I lack completely, I think. And so one of the things that, at least, I thought at least that talent was something like your genes, that is something that's constant over time. Is it something that you agree?
I think it is innate. We've developed a model of talent that the first characteristics is innateness. If it's something that emerges over time and is based on experience, then I think we have to define what talent is. But I think
then we at least narrow down some of I think the confusion that because many times performance is taken as a measure of talent.
Yeah.
So one of the many insightful graph was that a kind of triangle with all the blue dots, and then one person was a red.
Yep.
Okay, can you put it up again? That's a question. Because I think that's something, yeah. So what's on the y-axis here? So the horizontal axis you age.
Yeah, it could be performance. It could be any indicator that you think has got predictive value.
But I would think that the overall trend should be upwards.
Yeah, in
And
terms.
I think that the best is not improving over time, the best performance. But I think everything should be improving, is it?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like that's the Dutch speed skating and swimming data. It's a curve that is constantly improving over time with highs and lows around the performance over time, right?
Yeah,
which I think is maybe a better way of capturing what's happening.
And could it be that the kind of a definition of the talent is the slope of an individual relative to the average slope? So the talent of the individual will increase better.
Yeah. Well, it's a concept that you're talking about. This sort of rate of improvement is a lot of people have been exploring that since the 1950s. And one of the problems is it's hard to quantify because the indicators of performance and the factors that go into performance change over time. So we can do that at one time point, but the relevance of that time point to a future time point is going to change.
Okay, so I assume that it was possible because we made this graph, but you say actually it's impossible to make such a graph.
No, you might be able to do it conceptually. I don't know you'd be able to find performance to be able to do it, and unless you did it in sort of simple time-based sports, which is where we get the best, the best trajectories. Yeah.
You can just have the time, then as you get older, you get faster, until a certain age, and then you decline in performance.
Yeah, which I think are very good and useful models for speed skating coaches to look at where athletes are on pace. I think where we would advocate, I think, in those kinds of models is coaches spend too much time looking above the curve and not enough looking below.
If you agree with my definition of the talent, then what you should do at a young age is select the ones who are poorest, because they have the biggest chance that they will have a larger increase.
I think we have no confidence in anything that's been done in the past, so I think you should try that and let me know how it goes. But it's interesting because the data would back you up, right? That if we can figure out a way to keep people engaged in the system, in a lot of sports, how good a person is at the junior level is very poor predictor of the senior level. So what is happening in between? That person is staying in the system. So is the ultimate variable of prediction staying? Right? And so how do we promote that? We certainly don't do it by deselecting. Yeah.
I think it does.
Yeah, so thanks for your talk. So
Thanks.
you mentioned different examples of selection and selection bias. You also gave examples from some pretty successful competitions in the US. So from that perspective, you could say that despite all these problems with early selection, the program is actually pretty successful. But have you got any idea about the amount of people that are missed out?
Yeah. To be honest, no. And the reason is once they're gone, it's really hard to follow up with them. And so we don't really know how big the problem is. What we've tried to do is to frame the problem in a different way, which is around an argument that we don't actually want to get very good at predicting a player's performance, because if we could tell with all the 7-year-olds in our group who's going to make it to the Premier League and who's not, why would the rest of them stay in our high performance system? They'd go and do something else. But every player that becomes an elite performer, there's, you know, we're at the moment we're trying to quantify how many people are necessary for that single person who gets an Olympic medal. Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? Is it 69,999 in our basketball example? For me, those are efficiency questions. And the reason they're efficiency questions, and I think worth trying to figure out, is if I could tell to my 69,000 basketball players, you're not going to the NBA, but you could go to the Olympics in volleyball. Have you thought about a different sport? Then now we can move sports where we have great capacity to sports where we have low capacity, and we can support the entire system that way.
That's the Australian.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't say the Aussies were all bad.
So looking into the lens of my business, I think this is some identification doesn't look there is security. Just continues upon anyone ever experiment with just including a few remnants in actions in the next selection?
Not that I'm aware of. And it's a good question. And I think one of the reasons I like that question is because it challenges the orthodoxy of the way the system is set up right now, right? And the way that the system was created was out of necessity, not out of design, right? And so as we got more people into football clubs and ice hockey clubs, and we had to figure out a way to manage them, and we did it through deselection and through streaming. We never really thought about the problem from what's the best model for not just high performance, but for other levels. And I think it's a great question because when we see perturbations in the approaches that we use, so UK rugby is a great example. 10 years ago, they decided through evidence that they were not going to make any national team selections until at least the age of 15. And what the coaches said was, this is going to be a disaster, that nobody's going to stay in a rugby union, and rugby league is going to take all the players, they're going to go to football. We're not going to have any players if we wait that long. What happened was they had a better system. And the reason for that is because people that are best suited to rugby union will find rugby union. If you don't force that, again, that's the assumption of we have to stream or they won't find it. If you provide opportunities for athletes to find their best fit, they will find it. The problem now with the deselection model we have is that player that thinks they're going to basketball, but is better suited to volleyball, if they miss the window for development in volleyball, they're lost. And so again, that's an issue of efficiency. And yeah, maybe just design. Yeah, it's a good question though.
We were talking about reducing the effects of selection. So there are treatments about these that are deselected, develop and also other paths, shifting from identity to development. All those things cost a lot of resources. And I work in talent development and I believe.
Yeah.
And luckily we don't select people before the age of 18 actually.
Yeah.
But still, these things take up the most resources. So. Yeah, sometimes it's, how do you find the balance between actually making that selection that is
Yeah.
efficient and giving people the proper time and attention?
Yeah, we, does anyone ever, remember the show Game of Thrones? We have an approach that we call break the wheel, which is, let's redesign the system from the ground up. And part of that is resource sharing. So we don't have to stream people into football programs. We could stream them into team sport programs. And we can do that, you know, Johan Pion's got an approach where he looks at, well, what do people naturally like to do? We can put them into a number of activities that meet that sort of need and interest. And then we can develop them in a number of different capacities. Maybe they're gonna learn and develop aerobic energy systems, and they can go to any sort of aerobic-based sport. And maybe we don't need to teach the technical skills as early as we do, or at least not to the same focus as we currently do. And I think that's a useful model to consider. It's the Australian talent transfer model that they're implementing at the moment. But where we see it really useful and really in need is in the para system, where at least in Canada, for example, if you're a wheelchair basketball player in Calgary, well, there's not enough people in wheelchair basketball for you to play against. So you've got to pull in people from wheelchair tennis and wheelchair rugby, and you just have a wheelchair sports club. And they've seen really good development through that perspective because they don't stream and they don't specialize too early. And so that might be a way to manage. We don't have to increase more resources across the system. We just have to distribute them differently based on developmental needs.
The role of science not being to show that it's in principle impossible to do that in time.
That's not going to make me very popular with the coaches. Yeah, no callbacks from coaches for some reason. I don't know if it's to say that there's no predictive value, but it is to challenge the current models and the current paradigms, which I think is fair. We like to use that as a measuring stick of whether it's a group that we even want to work with. Because if we go in and have that, you know what, you guys are terrible at talent selection, we need to redesign your system. And they're like, thanks, but no thanks. Then, well, we know that you're not the right group. And so for us, it's, you know, scientists, it's about managing your time effectively. And so we use that as a measuring stick of whether this is a group we even want to engage with. I think the other thing is to, you know, we can criticize the talent ID and the coach selections and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, coaches still have to do it because they don't have resources. So standing on that, I think there's a lot of scientists that stand outside the system and throw stones at it. We try not to do that. We try to work with coaches and understand their realities and then figure out, okay, well, yeah, you've only got 10 spots. I can't give you 15, but of those 10, here's how you manage them better. I think that's maybe a fair way to work with them. It doesn't require us to compromise what we're saying about the process, but it helps us sort of sleep at night with all of the different groups that we work with, because we're not taking a very hard line in terms of what the science means. Because I think to be able to conclude that also requires us to have higher quality data than we currently have. At the moment, we have more questions than answers.
Maybe it's a very complex non-linear system.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think
Those terms might be less difficult or impossible to predict. Maybe then the focus on development that should be on a much shorter time scale.
yeah, maybe. And maybe that's the position that we can all get comfortable with, is that we need to have a system that focuses more on development instead of this, you know, everyone's an algorithm to be solved, right? An equation to just figure out what the right combination of variables in the right order is. Well, no, we're never going to get to that level of precision, but can we make general guidelines of here's how you nourish this type of an athlete who might not thrive and show superior performance for 5 years. And here's how you treat that person who's dominating right now. For me, I think it's this, there is no one size fits all model.
We're unfortunately out of time. Some other questions, I've got questions, well, but as far as I know, we should have drinks here somewhere to be able to kick on a little bit more, so feel free to stick around, but for now, many thanks, Joe, really interesting.